Hey, where's the gun? Ma'am, where's the gun? Okay, we'll take a look at it in a second. Where's the firearm? No, stay right there.
I'm going to get it.
No, don't get anything. All right, step over there. Step over there with that. Step over there.
It's in the kitchen.
Okay, step
Like,
over
sit on
there.
ground.
Step away from her.
She was 26 years old. She was pregnant. And on the morning of the shooting, she had already called the police twice that week asking for help. Nobody came. This is the story of Heather McCall, a young woman living in Athens-Clarke County, Georgia, who on one ordinary Tuesday morning made a decision that would end one life and consume her own. It is a story about fear, about the kind of fear that lives inside the body, that wakes you up at 3 in the morning and keeps you staring at the ceiling. It is a story about what happens when that fear meets a loaded gun. And it is a story about a system that failed 2 people at once. By 7 a.m., one of them would be dead. The other would be sitting in the back of a patrol car, her hands zip-tied, her face completely hollow, staring at nothing, saying nothing, because there was nothing left to say. Athens, Georgia is a college town. It has wide streets lined with oak trees, coffee shops that open before sunrise, and the kind of morning quiet that makes you feel like the world is still holding its breath. In the residential neighborhoods east of downtown, the houses are modest, single-story homes, narrow driveways, chain-link fences in the backyards. Heather McCall lived in one of those neighborhoods. She had lived there for about a year. She had moved there to get distance, to reset, to put some physical space between herself and a relationship that had slowly, methodically taken pieces of her. She was in her second trimester. People who knew Heather described her as someone who kept to herself. She was not loud. She was not dramatic. She went to work. She came home. She tried to keep the life around her small and manageable. But the relationship with Jeremy Howard had never been small. Jeremy was 31. He had a broad physical presence. He was the kind of man who filled a room whether he wanted to or not. People who knew him said he could be charming, warm even when the mood was right. But there was another version of Jeremy. Heather had lived with that version. She had lived with the shouting that happened behind closed doors, the grip on her arm that left marks, the moment where affection flipped into something controlled, something punishing. She had left him. That should have been the end of it. But Jeremy did not accept endings. In the weeks before that Tuesday morning, Heather had made calls. She had reached out to law enforcement. She had told them that Jeremy had been showing up, that he was not respecting the boundaries she had tried to create. The calls were logged. The response was minimal. On the night before the shooting, Heather did not sleep well. She would later tell investigators that she had heard sounds outside, that she had checked the door, that the dread she carried everywhere had been louder than usual that night. She had a firearm in the house. Multiple, it would turn out. But in that moment, she was thinking of one specific one. She was thinking about protection. She was thinking about the baby. She was thinking about what Jeremy might do if he came through that door and she had nothing in her hands. By 6:30 in the morning, the neighborhood was beginning to stir. Trash trucks in the distance, a dog barking somewhere down the block. The kind of ordinary morning sounds that make a place feel alive. Heather was awake. She had probably not slept more than a few hours. She had no idea that in less than 30 minutes, everything she knew would be over. There is always a moment. Investigators who work violent crime will tell you this. There is always a point in the timeline where if one thing had gone differently, no one would have died. A different route home, a phone call that connected, a door that stayed locked. For Heather McCall, that moment arrived sometime around 6:50 in the morning. That was when Jeremy Howard showed up. He did not knock. By Heather's account, he did not knock because he never knocked. Knocking implies respect for the threshold. Knocking implies that the person on the other side has a choice about whether to let you in. Jeremy did not operate on those terms. He came through the door. The accounts of exactly how are not fully clear. Whether he had a key that Heather had not yet managed to take back, whether he forced the entry, whether the door was unlocked. What is clear is that he was inside, and Heather was not ready. She had the gun. She had retrieved it at some point during the night or early morning. She would tell investigators later that she had not planned to use it, that she had not gone to sleep with violence in her mind. She wanted to scare him. That is what she said. She wanted to hold it up and make him stop, make him take her seriously in the way that words had never made him. She had tried words for years. She had tried leaving. She had tried phone calls to a system that had not mobilized fast enough. The gun in her mind was a language he might actually understand. This is the decision that changed everything. Not because she was wrong about Jeremy's capacity for violence. She was probably not wrong. Not because her fear was manufactured. It was not. But because a firearm in a charged moment between two people with a history of violence is not a deterrent, it is a trigger, literally and figuratively. Heather raised the weapon. There was a confrontation. The exact words are not fully recorded. What happened next would be described by Heather as an accident. The gun discharged. She said she did not mean for it to fire. The bullet struck Jeremy Howard in the abdomen. He went down. The room went from chaos to silence in under 2 seconds. And then the silence became something much worse. The sound of the shot brought the neighborhood to attention. A neighbor called 911, then another, then Heather herself. Dispatchers would later describe the call as one of the more difficult ones to process. The caller was barely coherent. She was telling them what had happened, but the words kept collapsing into each other. She told them there had been a shooting. She told them it was at her address. She told them that Jeremy was on the floor. Units from the Athens-Clarke County Police Department were already in the area. Body cameras clicked on. Officers arrived at the scene within minutes. The first unit to respond later described what they found when they came through the front entrance of the property. Jeremy Howard was on the ground. He was conscious but unresponsive to verbal commands. He was losing blood at a rate that made the responding officer move immediately. Heather was nearby. She was not fleeing. She was not trying to hide. She was standing with her hands partially raised. Her face was already doing the thing that faces do when a person has passed through shock and arrives somewhere on the other side of it. The gun was on the floor. She had put it down, or dropped it. The distinction would matter later in court. Emergency medical technicians arrived within the next few minutes. Jeremy was loaded onto a stretcher. The injury was serious. Abdominal gunshot wounds carry a complicated set of outcomes. They can be survivable with fast intervention. The officers on scene noted that the wound was significant. Jeremy was transported to a nearby hospital. Heather was detained at the scene. She was not placed under formal arrest at that exact moment. She was placed in a patrol vehicle. The officers were beginning the process of figuring out what had happened in that house. Outside, the neighborhood had come to its front porches. People were watching. It was barely 7 in the morning, and a pregnant woman was sitting in the back of a police cruiser, and somewhere across town, a 31-year-old man was in surgery. The day had already broken in ways that could not be repaired. The scene inside the house told its own story. Officers began a systematic walkthrough while the investigation was still in its earliest phase. The entry point was noted, the location where Jeremy had fallen, the position of the firearm on the floor. Then they found more. During the search of the property, officers discovered a significant number of additional weapons. Not just the one that had been fired, multiple firearms, stored in different locations throughout the house, and narcotics. The discovery changed the texture of the case immediately. What had begun as a potential defensive shooting in the context of domestic violence was now something more complicated. A home containing multiple unregistered weapons and controlled substances introduced questions about Heather's legal standing, about the context in which these items had entered the residence, and about the broader pattern of her life over the preceding months. At the hospital, Jeremy Howard was in the operating room. The surgical team was working. At the scene, investigators were photographing bagging evidence and walking through the space with the careful attention that a potential homicide demands, because that is what it was being treated as, a potential homicide. At some point, an officer approached the patrol vehicle where Heather was sitting. She was asked if she wanted water. She shook her head. She was asked if she needed medical attention for the pregnancy. She said she was fine. She did not appear fine. One officer who was present later described the way she looked as completely gone, not uncooperative, not hostile, just absent, like a person watching something happen to themselves from a very far distance. She was still sitting in that car when the call came in from the hospital. Jeremy Howard had not made it through surgery. He had died. The injury had been too extensive. The officer who delivered the news to Heather described what happened next as one of the most difficult things he had witnessed in his career. She broke, not in an explosive way, not screaming or throwing herself against the door of the cruiser. She simply collapsed inward. Her whole body seemed to fold. She pressed her face into her hands. Her shoulders heaved. She was now no longer a potential witness to an accidental discharge. She was a suspect in a homicide. Everything that came next would move through that lens. The interrogation room at the Athens-Clarke County Police Department is not designed for comfort. That is not an accident. The room is small. The lighting is flat and unforgiving. The chairs are hard. The table between the investigator and the subject is not very wide, which means that the distance between a trained detective and a frightened person is measured in inches rather than feet. Heather McCall was brought into that room several hours after the shooting. She had been processed. She had been advised of her rights. The Miranda warning had been read to her clearly, and she had indicated that she understood. She had not requested an attorney at that point. That choice would have consequences. The lead investigator on the case entered the room and took a seat. What the body camera footage captures in the initial moments is a study in contrast. The investigator is calm, settled, asking about water, about whether Heather needs anything before they begin. Heather is diminished. She looks smaller than she is. Her hands are on the table in front of her, and she keeps looking down at them. The investigator begins with the kind of open-ended questions that experienced detectives use to let subjects fill the silence themselves. Tell me about this morning. Tell me about Jeremy. Tell me what happened before we arrived. What follows is a painful, halting account. Not smooth, not rehearsed, not the version of a person who has constructed a story in advance. What comes out is fragmented, circling. She goes back and corrects herself. She starts a sentence and cannot finish it. She talks about the history, about the relationship, about the things Jeremy had done to her, about the fear that had been living in her chest for months before that morning. She describes the moment he came through the door. She describes picking up the gun, and then she describes something that investigators hear with a particular kind of attention the moment she says the gun just went off. Those 4 words, the gun just went off. In a courtroom, those 4 words carry enormous weight. They are either the truth and accidental discharge in a moment of terror, or they are the framing that someone uses when they want to remove intention from the equation. The investigator does not change expression. The investigator asks her to describe the moment more specifically. She tries. Her description is not inconsistent in its essentials. She is not telling different versions, but she is struggling to access the details of a moment that happened inside an adrenaline surge that her nervous system is still processing. She keeps returning to the same point. She did not want to kill him. She says it 3 times in the first hour of the interview. She did not want him dead. She wanted him to stop. The investigator sits with this, nods, writes something down. Then comes the question about the other weapons and the drugs. The room gets quieter. Heather admitted to the firearm immediately. There was no hesitation about the shooting itself. She knew that she had fired the gun. She knew that the bullet had struck Jeremy. She knew that he was dead. There was no version of the interrogation where she tried to pretend she had not been in that room. But she was careful about the other things. The additional weapons in the house, the narcotics, the specific circumstances under which those items had come to be inside her home. She did not deny that they were there. The officers had already found them. Denial would have been futile, and she seemed to understand that. What she was more cautious about was attribution. Who owned what? Who had brought what into the residence? Whether some of those items had belonged to Jeremy or to other people who had been in that space. Investigators noted her use of passive language when discussing these items. Things were there. Things had been left. She did not use ownership language readily. This is a pattern that experienced interrogators watch for. Not necessarily because it indicates guilt, but because it indicates calculation. It means that even in a state of shock and grief, part of the subject's mind is still managing the narrative. Heather was also careful when talking about Jeremy's death directly. When the investigator confirmed again in the room that Jeremy had not survived, her response was visceral. It was not performative. Body language analysts who review this kind of footage look for consistency between physiological response and emotional expression. Heather's distress read as genuine. Her hands shook. She had difficulty speaking for several minutes. But she did not ask to stop the interview. She kept going. In part, investigators believed because she felt the need to explain herself, to make them understand the context, to place the firearm in the morning and the decision to pick it up in the years of history that preceded it. She talked about specific incidents of violence, one in which she had been thrown against a wall, one in which he had threatened her during a previous pregnancy, one in which she had spent a night in a car because she was afraid to be inside the house with him. None of these incidents had resulted in formal charges. They had not been documented in the way that would have made them automatically admissible, which meant that Heather sitting in that room was the only one telling this story, and she was sitting there without a lawyer. What she did not say in that room was also significant. She did not express anger at Jeremy, not once. Even in describing the violence, even in describing the morning, she expressed fear, she expressed grief, she expressed confusion, but not anger. Whether this was genuine or strategic, or simply the emotional reality of a woman who had been conditioned over years to suppress her own rage? The interrogation transcript does not answer. That answer lives somewhere Heather has never fully brought into the light. The investigative process in this case moved on two parallel tracks. The first track was the shooting itself. The question of what had happened in that house at approximately 7 a.m. and whether it constituted a criminal act or a justified use of force. The second track was the search of the property. The weapons and the narcotics opened a separate and significant line of inquiry. On the forensic side, investigators worked the scene with care. The position of Jeremy's body in relation to where Heather said she had been standing was consistent with her account. The trajectory of the bullet, the angle of entry, and the location of the casing on the floor all supported the general sequence she had described. What the forensic evidence could not do was determine intent. Intent lives inside a person's mind. The physical evidence can tell you where someone was standing and which direction the gun was pointing. It cannot tell you what was in that person's heart when the trigger was pulled. The body camera footage was reviewed in detail. The officers who had arrived on scene had not found a woman trying to flee. They had not found a stage scene. They had found a woman standing next to a man who had been shot in a state of profound distress, who had called 911 herself. This was noted. The presence of additional firearms in the home complicated the investigation considerably. Under Georgia state law, a convicted felon is prohibited from possessing firearms. If Heather had prior convictions and the investigation was now looking into her background, the very weapon she had used in what she claimed was self-defense may have been illegally possessed to begin with. Her background check returned results. The specifics of her prior record were examined in the context of the new charges being built around her. The narcotics discovered in the residence added another layer. Possession charges were possible. Depending on the quantity and type of controlled substances, the potential charges multiplied. Meanwhile, the domestic violence angle was being investigated with the same rigor. The prior calls Heather had made to law enforcement were pulled. They were reviewed. Investigators confirmed that reports had been made. They confirmed that the response to those reports had been limited. This documentation was important. It did not clear Heather of the shooting, but it established a pattern. It placed the events of that morning inside a history that had been building for years. Jeremy Howard's background was also examined. His history included incidents that corroborated what Heather had described in the interrogation room. He was not without a record of his own. This was a case investigators were beginning to understand where the line between victim and perpetrator was not the clean, straight thing that makes for easy prosecution. It was crooked, it was old, and it ran through both people in that house. The legal process took time. Cases involving domestic violence history, accidental discharge claims, and compounding drug and weapons charges do not move quickly through the system. There are hearings, there are motions, there are negotiations between prosecutors and defense attorneys that happen far from the courtroom. Heather McCall was charged. The primary charge was voluntary manslaughter. The prosecution argued that while Heather's fear may have been real, the act of raising a loaded firearm and discharging it, regardless of her stated intent, constituted the unlawful killing of another person in the heat of passion. They did not charge her with murder. The distinction is significant. Murder requires premeditation. The prosecution did not believe the evidence supported a premeditation argument. What they argued was that this was a death that resulted from an escalated emotional confrontation and that Heather was responsible for that escalation. The defense countered with the history, the calls to law enforcement, the documented pattern of Jeremy's behavior, the terror of being a pregnant woman alone in a house with a man who had physically harmed her before. Georgia's laws around self-defense and the so-called stand your ground provisions were argued at length. In the end, a plea agreement was reached. Heather McCall was sentenced to 4 years in state prison. She would serve that sentence while being separated from the child she had been carrying on the morning of the shooting. The baby had been born while Heather was awaiting trial. The child was placed with a family member. The charges related to the weapons and the narcotics were folded into the overall resolution of the case. Additional penalties were assessed. The 4 years represented a negotiated outcome. The prosecution had been prepared to seek more. The defense had argued for less. 4 years, for a life, for a morning that lasted less than 5 minutes, for a relationship that had been consuming her for years before the gun was ever in her hand. There is no number that resolves what happened in that house. 4 years is not justice. It may not even be the right word. It is a number that a system arrived at after accounting for factors it could measure and ignoring the ones it could not. People tell the truth in interrogation rooms even when they are lying. This sounds contradictory, but experienced behavioral analysts will tell you that the way a person shapes their story, the language they choose, the pauses they take, the things they circle back to without being asked, all of it communicates something that transcends the literal content of the words. When you review Heather McCall's interrogation footage, several things stand out. The first is the absence of anger. She describes a man who physically harmed her, who showed up in her home uninvited, who had threatened her during a previous pregnancy, and she does not once express rage, even under direct questioning about his behavior. Even when the investigator, in a technique sometimes called empathy, mirroring, invites her to express how she really felt about what he did to her, she does not take the invitation. She stays in fear. Psychologists who work with survivors of intimate partner violence recognize this pattern. People who have been in abusive relationships for extended periods often undergo a kind of emotional flattening. The anger gets suppressed, not because they are not angry, but because expressing anger at their abuser was historically not safe. The body learns. The expression system shuts that particular channel down. Heather's lack of visible anger is not evidence of innocence or guilt. It is evidence of a trauma response that had been conditioned over years. The second thing that stands out is the way she describes the gun itself. She does not own the moment of the shooting with full agency. She says the gun went off. She says it happened. The passive construction is notable. Whether this reflects the genuine psychological experience of a dissociated moment under extreme stress, or whether it reflects a conscious decision to distance herself from the act, the footage cannot tell us. What it can tell us is that she has not fully integrated that moment into her sense of herself as an agent. The third, and perhaps most revealing element, is the way she responds to the confirmation of Jeremy's death. Her grief in that moment is not the grief of someone who got what they wanted. It does not carry the qualities of relief or satisfaction or closure. It carries the qualities of devastation, of someone who has just lost something, even if that something was also a source of harm. Intimate partner violence is not simple. People do not simply stop loving the people who hurt them. The attachment and the abuse coexist, sometimes for years, sometimes forever. Heather's grief in that interrogation room was the grief of someone who did not want Jeremy to die, even if she was also afraid of him, even if she had been trying to get away from him, even if some part of her had picked up the gun, knowing what it could do. Those two things can both be true. The tragedy of this case is that they were. Jeremy Howard was 31 years old. He had a family. He had people who loved him. People for whom the phone call on that Tuesday morning ended one version of their world. He was a person who existed in full, who had a history before Heather and a history that ran alongside her, who had interests in habits and relationships that had nothing to do with the worst things he ever did. But the worst things he ever did were real. The violence he brought into that relationship was real. The incidents Heather described in the interrogation room were real. The pattern of behavior, the showing up uninvited, the disregard for her stated limits, the physical harm was real. Both things are true of Jeremy Howard. He was a person of full humanity. And he was a person who used his body to frighten and harm a woman who was carrying his child. These two truths do not cancel each other out. They sit side by side. They have to. Because if we flatten Jeremy into only a victim, we erase the context that made that morning possible. And if we flatten him into only an abuser, we deny the grief of the people who loved him. His family mourned him. They had questions. Questions about why it had come to this, about what the system had done or not done in the years and months before that morning. Those questions do not have clean answers. What can be said is that Jeremy Howard also needed intervention that did not come. Not intervention to protect him from Heather, but intervention to interrupt the pattern of behavior that put him in that house on that morning. Programs for men in abusive relationships, accountability structures that might have reached him years before everything came apart. He did not receive those either. Two people who both needed help from a system that was not paying attention. One is dead, one went to prison, and a child grew up without either of their parents. That child is the one we should not forget. This case is not unusual. That is the hardest thing to sit with. The specific details are particular to Heather McCall and Jeremy Howard, to Athens-Clarke County, to that specific house on that specific morning. But the pattern underneath it is one that plays out thousands of times a year in the United States. A woman in an abusive relationship reaches out for help. The help does not arrive in time. She takes action to protect herself. That action has consequences she did not intend. The legal system designed to address individual criminal acts rather than patterns of harm processes her as a perpetrator. The first lesson this case offers is about the failure of intervention. Heather called law enforcement before the shooting more than once. The documentation exists. The calls were made, and yet Jeremy Howard was able to walk into her house on a Tuesday morning without anyone having created a structural barrier to that outcome. When victims of domestic violence reach out for help, and that help does not materialize, they are left with two options: absorb the violence or address it themselves. Neither option ends well. The first leads to escalating harm. The second, as this case demonstrates, can lead to tragedy even when the intent is survival rather than harm. The second lesson is about firearms in the context of intimate partner violence. Domestic violence experts consistently note that the presence of a firearm in a home with a history of intimate partner violence dramatically increases the risk of a fatal outcome. Not because the people in those homes are more violent by nature, but because a firearm changes the stakes of a confrontation instantly and irreversibly. Heather believed that having a gun made her safer. In the context of an ongoing abusive relationship, this belief is understandable. The gun feels like an equalizer. It feels like agency. It feels like the thing that will finally make a larger, stronger person stop. What this case demonstrates is that a weapon brought into a confrontation between two people with a volatile history does not resolve that history. It accelerates it. The third lesson is about the criminal justice system's capacity to hold complexity. What happened to Heather is not captured by a single charge. Voluntary manslaughter is a legal category. It carries a specific definition and a specific range of penalties. But it does not describe the full picture of what Heather McCall was. She was a victim of sustained intimate partner violence. She was a woman who had sought help and been failed. She was a pregnant woman in a moment of terror who made a decision she could not take back. All of those things are also true. Courts are not well designed to process that kind of multi-layered truth. They move forward on charges and evidence. They sentence based on statute. They are not equipped to deliver the kind of justice that accounts for the full human context of what leads someone to a courtroom. This is not a criticism of the specific people who process this case. It is an observation about the structure of the system itself. And it is a structure that we as a society have chosen. Until we choose something different, mornings like this one in Athens, Georgia will keep happening. There is a moment in the body camera footage from that morning that keeps returning. After Heather has been told that Jeremy is dead, after she has processed it inside the patrol vehicle, after the initial wave of shock has passed, and the next wave, the long, slow wave of what this means, has begun to arrive. An officer opens the door to check on her. He asks if she needs anything. She shakes her head. Then she looks down at her stomach. Just for a second, it is the gesture of a woman who knows she is pregnant, who has just understood that the next chapter of her life, the chapter she was trying to build when she moved to this neighborhood, when she tried to put distance between herself and Jeremy, when she made those phone calls that no one answered fast enough, is now permanently different from anything she could have imagined. She does not speak. She just looks down, and then she looks back up, at nothing in particular. That image stays with you. Not because it answers anything. It does not. It does not tell us whether Heather's finger pulled that trigger deliberately or accidentally. It does not resolve the question of what Jeremy would have done if she had not been armed. It does not restore life. It stays with you because it is a completely human moment inside a story that is very easy to reduce to headlines. Pregnant woman shoots ex-boyfriend. 4 words. They tell you almost nothing. What they leave out is everything. They leave out the years of fear, the unanswered phone calls, the morning she woke up not knowing if he would appear, the weight of knowing that you love someone who also harms you, the impossible calculation of being a pregnant woman alone in a house and hearing a door come open. They leave out Jeremy's humanity, his family, the people sitting in a waiting room at a hospital who got the news that the surgery had not been enough. They leave out the child, born into this, inheriting a story that began before they took their first breath. When we tell these stories, the ones that happen at 7 a.m. in neighborhoods where the oak trees are still and the coffee shops are just an opening, we have an obligation to resist the simple version, to sit with the complicated one, because the complicated one is the only version that might teach us something. The question this case asks is not whether Heather McCall was guilty. A court decided that. The question this case asks is what would have had to be different? What earlier intervention? What faster response? What structure for accountability? What alternative to a loaded gun as the last line of defense for a woman who was afraid? What would have saved both of them? Because both of them needed saving, and both of them were failed. If you or someone you know is experiencing intimate partner violence, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Advocates are standing by. You do not have to wait until it becomes a story. You are the story right now. And the story does not have to end the way this one did.